Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Turnitin. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Kevin Bell, who has a wide range of experience across Australia and the US in higher education, and right now is KPMG Education Consultant and the founder of Digital Education Analytics. Thanks very much, firstly, for joining us, Kevin.
No, it's all good to be here.
Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself and what your background is, first of all?
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned I'd spent quite a bit of time in the States. I'm actually from the UK originally, actually not far from where you're from. So yeah. my accent's a little confused. I spent about a decade in Japan prior to that teaching English and sort of learned experientially the ins and outs and successes and failures of pedagogy and instruction, sometimes to classes of 45 English speakers who really didn't want to speak English at all. So, sort of learned a bit about motivation, etc. And then transitioned to the US. My wife is Canadian, so the US seemed like a compromise solution. And we landed there for a couple of years to do our master's and ended up staying about another decade and a half. So one thing had sort of led to another. I started off in .com world, but kept a foot sort of in adjunct or sectional instruction. And then got pulled back there, actually post 9/11 in the US. The .com I went to stopped operations, so I went back and taught at the institution where I'd taken my master's. And then from there, sort of proceeded through a range. I spent time at Southern New Hampshire, which is a pretty innovative and exciting institution, and worked at Northeastern in Boston prior to coming over to Australia in 2016. Where I transitioned and worked at Western Sydney up until the end of last year. So I wish I could say there's been a brilliant plan and it's been a thought out strategic move through life, but it's just been serendipity and good fortune, and had some great experiences and wonderful opportunities. So that's kind of how I got where I am today.
That's great. Yeah, really, really interesting. And as you say, we've got a lot of similarity in our backgrounds, and yeah, it's kind of both started in the UK, experienced in Japan, and now ended up in Australia through different routes. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I thought it'd be interesting to speak to you today and for our audience to hear it was the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, kind of around the micro-credentialing, the short course sort of focus and theme that we're hearing a lot, especially here in Australia at the moment. We've had the government pushing short courses at universities. Micro-credentialing is something that I know the sector have been looking at over the past couple of years. And then additionally, we've just seen a company like Google coming out and saying that they're going to be doing this scholarship scheme, and if students complete the short course that they're doing, that they'll see that as equivalent to an undergraduate qualification for jobs at Google. And I know this is something that you're interested in, that you've had experience in. So my sort of first question really to you is, why do you think this is suddenly becoming very relevant? And what is your sort of take on the whole thing? What does it mean for higher education that this interest and we're going down this route?
I'll maybe sort of go reverse and answer the second one first. I think it's significant for higher ed. I think that when you work in an area that sort of looks at things like online and technology that's emergent these days, there's always that thought that you should be looking at what disruptors might come along. And higher ed's been sort of playing with that for about 20 years, I would say, in terms of transition into online and looking at other modalities. And it is very difficult. If you look at sort of disruption theory, it is difficult for an established institution to disrupt itself. I think, you're probably seeing quite a bit of this at Turnitin as things change. How can an incumbent with all of its structures and politics, et cetera, shift and do things radically differently? I think what's happened, particularly in the last 6 months with the pandemic, is it's forced institutions to think, what if? So the what if's been a long way off, and people sometimes talk about the tragedy of the horizon. If something is far enough off that you can kind of put it off for a bit longer and almost sort of, bequeath it to your descendants, then you're not going to do anything. So climate change is the classic one there. People have felt that it's a concern, but it's been far enough off to ignore. And I think in many ways, universities have been in a similar position. The majority have been thinking about transitioning and online and alternative credentials and that kind of thing. But it was far enough off that they didn't have to really think about it. In the States, where I was for a number of years, there are much larger numbers of institutions, and some of them are done or close to done now. So, when I was at Southern New Hampshire was right in that sweet spot. It wasn't so prestigious that the horizon was way, way off. And I think that's still the case for a lot of the, the sort of Ivy League schools, the Harvards, the MITs and others. Although they are doing some innovative work, it's not being credit bearing, and they've not got to change their offering at all, because people are still, flocking to go there. Northeastern, where I worked, rejects something like 95% of applicants. They're only taking 5% of the applicant pool. So a lot could happen before Northeastern would be in trouble. Some of the smaller institutions, and Southern New Hampshire was sort of around there, 2008 or so when I started. They had about 3,000-4,000 face-to-face students, and we'd started a fledgling online that had, getting towards a similar number. So 3,000 sounds like an institution that is somewhat diverse. Just to give you an idea of where they're at now, they're still around 4,000 on-campus students, but they've got about 90,000 online.
Wow.
It's an institution that's radically shifted and disrupted itself, because now the huge predominant number of students is in a different environment. So I think, the pandemic sort of forced that discussion, forced that thinking. It's also, if you like, I think, encouraged or empowered others like Google and some of the bigger providers and consultants to think about whether academia is going to move quickly enough. I think that's the concern, that we've always in academia known that there was this coming change. The horizon was far off. We could get to it next week or next month or next year, and nothing fundamentally has had to change. Now, obviously, the pandemic sort of forced a lot of the discussion and thinking around that, and institutions have had to sort of make jumps, and they've done it in the way institutions tend to, which is sort of in isolation. There have not been many calls across the sector saying, hey, shall we collaborate on, a disrupted program that they could do half of here, half of there, half of somewhere else. They've been a bit sort of isolated. So I think the time's there now because A, the pandemic, but B, there's a growth now of alternative providers. And I think there's a growing sense that if universities and institutions don't disrupt themselves, someone else is going to step in. And as you mentioned, Google's looking at that. There's the likes of Deloitte, Amazon, IBM, PwC, lots of organizations, LinkedIn, your own institution, that are looking and saying, if academia is not going to move, maybe we have to do it in a different way. And academia has had that benefit of a piece of paper from this institution. People can look at that and go, that's a proxy, that kind of counts. But there was a fairly significant revision of a study I've seen a number of times that came out in February, a Deloitte RMIT study that asked that question of chief academic officers, and so at an academic institution or provosts, and the sort of CEOs at companies, and said, are you getting enough work-ready graduates, or are your graduates work-ready? And the academics are saying, 80% are saying, yeah, our academics are ready to start work tomorrow. And the CEOs and the CFOs are saying, we can't get people with the skills we need. So there's a fundamental disconnect there. The pandemic might push institutions to jump and move and get up to speed, but it's a big lift. And I think there are opportunities now with platforms, technologies that weren't there 5 years ago. And someone's going to do it. It could be on the corporate side. It could be a partnership. It could be on the academic side. But as I say, it's very difficult for an institution to disrupt itself. And I think that's what we're seeing at the minute.
So do you say, therefore, then, that it's essentially the traditional 4-year or 3-year course is no longer, it doesn't need to be that deep, it needs to be more specialized, and short courses, micro-credentials can help with that? Or how do you, do you think that there's still, I assume you think there's still a future for a 3-year undergraduate bachelor's degree to some extent, but how do you kind of see the two things playing together a little bit, I guess?
I think that's really interesting, because I think, to that initial statement, that there is a huge value to a 3 or 4-year undergraduate experience. And I'm sure you and I had that, that sort of safety net of going to an institution, but you haven't quite left home, and if you live near enough, you can take your laundry home at weekends. But it's all the non-curricular and extracurricular elements to that, a lot of universities don't don't package those things together. My previous institution, Western Sydney, is not a residential campus.
Mm-hmm.
So the students are engaged and attending for maybe 3 years, but they're not getting a lot of those skills that a lot of research has shown are valuable at the bachelor's. And I think the recent sort of federal moves towards restricting funding on the liberal arts, on humanities, etc., and ramping up funding on really applied areas and STEM sort of speaks to that as well. There's a bit of undervaluing of the liberal arts and of the sense of a rounded member of society who's going to contribute to society. And ironically, I did see a bit more of that in the States than I have done in Australia. There seems to be an acknowledgement that university, polytechnic, whatever, is a good place to go to get those rounder skills that are going to benefit society no matter what you do. If you take those out of the equation, then you're sort of left with what are the hard skills, the core skills. And, not that this is a viable statistic necessarily, but it's an interesting one. There's been quite a bit of research done into the efficacy of a lecture. And in a 1-hour lecture, there's effectively about 18 to 20 minutes of content that is valuable, that's critical, that is, applied, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're to extend that ratio, then you're saying about a third of the lecture time that you have is actually critical. The rest is this sort of peripheral around the edges pieces that, to be honest, a lot of students aren't taken advantage of. The attendance at face-to-face lectures in many institutions is woeful.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen numerous, 200 strong classes that are down to 20 by week 2 or week 3. So if you're not getting the peripheral bits that, I think we all agree are beneficial from a 3-year bachelor's, including residence, including whatever, playing for the football team, whatever else you're going to do with it, debating society. If you're not getting those extra bits, the non-curricular bits, then the core curriculum bits are actually much more succinct and packageable. And I think those are the bits that are translating across. I think it does beg the question for Australia and globally, where are people going to get those societally beneficial skills that we aren't giving them in a residential model and that maybe micro-credentials don't hit? I think that's the bit that's difficult to work out. Where are people going to get those skills from? Are they still valued? Possibly through experiential. So, internships, applied work. I think a mix of micro-credential and some sort of internship or some sort of experience where the students are immersed in a real-world, authentic environment and have to collaborate. It may not be face-to-face, but it needs to be, social and needs to be collaborative. And we need to work out what image you're projecting of yourself and how you're articulating an argument, et cetera, and how you're working with a group which could include multiple nationalities and multiple personalities. So I think the micro piece takes a lot of the core content, the core elements, and can package it in a more efficient way. I don't think it addresses fully the question of where are the softer skills coming from. So I think that's the big unknown at the minute, the like for like, competence to code, competence to do analytics, etc., can exist in both environments. And I think ultimately, the traditional model is inefficient. If we're talking, if that ratio sort of stands at about 20 minutes of an hour, if we extend that to 3 years and we're saying, well, there's a year that's really core and beneficial, if that starts to be packaged by institutions into micro credentialing, then it's doable, over a year and a half doing online courses. So I think it's that balance. It's how much Australia and other countries value those social skills. How much is it important that higher ed puts out a valuable member of society, irrespective of what their content expertise is? And then the other applied question of, can we get the content and the expertise to make them competent in this job in a shorter period of time?
I think that's fascinating, and I think I personally agree with a lot of it, actually, in terms of you almost need to split the two things, right? You need to split skills competency from, I guess, growing up or becoming a member of society or whatever we want to call it. And I have my own views being an arts graduate as well in terms of what the government views are on of arts funding versus STEM type funding. But if we think about what we specialize in, thinking about integrity and creating, we have a phrase of creating citizens of integrity. I think there's an awful lot of the academic experience in being part of university that's built up through that, which can then is valuable in your future life. But I think, as you say, that especially at the moment with, I think it's possible to recreate some of that, not face-to-face, but it's a lot easier if you're in a face-to-face environment, right? Because there's so much stuff that comes around that. And I think the challenge for universities, obviously at the moment, is with everything being online, but also for future, is when people do then see that you can learn and do the core things online a lot faster without any of the rest of it, then where is the value in that, and how it's about then reinforcing that, I guess, and or like you say, presenting it in a different way to make clear that the value that the rest of that brings.
I think we have to accept, and there are numerous quotes flown around that some people despise and I think are interesting, and we have to unpack the sense that, why would I test knowledge? Google knows everything. Mm-hmm. And I actually had a session talking about authentic assessment with an institution I'm working with currently, and the question was coming up, high stakes exams versus. And one of the slides that I developed had this quote saying, imagine your boss comes in and says, I want a detailed report first thing in the morning tomorrow. It's got to be 10 pages and you can't use a computer or look anything up or talk to anyone.
Yeah.
You might be able to do it, James. You're protected on that one. And what you're effectively saying is we've got these tools. This is the reality of the world right now. And we're going to tie one hand behind your back and ask you to write left-handed and still do that. So I know that's a contentious statement that the Google knows everything. Yes, but content is more and more ubiquitous. I looked at a recent figure. 500 hours of video were uploaded to YouTube every minute. So every minute of the day, 500 hours worth of content is going up there. And those students who aren't going to face-to-face lectures, and I have my kids to sort of reference as well. They're in high school, but they just go and get YouTube and learn stuff from there. And if they're motivated to learn it, they'll find the content. And I know MOOCs and open platforms are not as open as they were when they kicked off. But if you can find a Stanford, a Harvard, or an MIT lecture in your discipline on the subject, are you going to be motivated to, get on a bus, risk everything that risks right now, through the rain, whatever, and arrive at a lecture theater where, you have to socially distance? You've got all those issues. And if you can get a version of that online, it's not going to be what the content is or how you get the content. It's what you can do with the content. And I think that's the most difficult transition. There are institutions, certainly globally, and a couple that I've been involved with, that have really moved towards competency-based education. And I think, as we're saying with the prior conversation, there's the knowledge, there's the skills, what you can do with that, there's the being a good human being. So there are multiple targets, but I'm not sure that our traditional institutions are focusing on the ones that they have the biggest value add for. If they're focusing on delivering content and reading bullet points off a slide, and that's why you're going to class, then I would understand if you never went back to class ever again. You've got the LMS, you can deliver the content, you can have students find their own content, you can have students structure their own questions, their deliverables. That face-to-face, if we've got it, needs to be a super, super value add that makes you a super employable person, and it makes you a damn good human being. Mm-hmm. That's the bit that we miss. The didactic lecture to 200 people, 150 of them aren't there, and 30 of them are not paying attention. That's become a cliche, but there are elements that are still there, and there are elements that are hard to get institutions to move beyond. And I actually think this sort of micro-credential push, and particularly when the Googles and PwCs and IBMs of the world start getting on board, I think it's a kick in the pants. And I think institutions need to not only sort out their own offerings, but need to start looking across institutions and say, why are we not collaborating around this? Why are we all trying to do a hybrid or online version of Psychology 101? There's a great version, let's collaborate on it. Let's have guest experts. Let's have students really learn the content. And then, we'll do a gathering, whether it's a face-to-face or virtual. Let's get people from UNSW arguing against people from Western Sydney, arguing against Deakin guys. Let's give them roles. Let's give them put them in a real-world environment, and let's change all the criteria halfway through the activity just to mess with them. I mean, that's sort of the stuff that happens in real world, right?
Yeah.
We're all living that right now. None of us would have predicted 6 months ago, here's where we'll be 6 months from now. And we're all having to deal with it in whatever way, we can. I'm not going to ask what you have on below the waist, but yeah, I'm casual pants, man.
I'm actually wearing proper trousers right now. Yeah.